It was announced today that Starix has left Na'vi from the position of being their coach. Now, this is actually one of the solutions, in part, to Na'vi's leadership crisis that I outlined in an article I published today, so it's in the description box below, which is getting a new coach. And so already the first step's been taken where Starix has been removed. Now, the reason why it's significant that Starix has stepped down, left, been kicked, whatever it may be, is not simply because of the effect it has on Na'vi, but the incredible historical significance of this move. Because Starix was actually not only a founding member of Na'vi, he was the person who created the Na'vi lineup. When Arbalet, this multi-millionaire oil magnate, whatever that guy's job was from Kazakhstan, came to Starix wanting to make the Na'vi team, he actually told Starix, pick out the best players from the Ukraine, but they have to be players that fit together to make the best team. Don't pick people based on politics or who you like or who doesn't like anyone else or who's played together before. You have to just pick the right players for this team. And he did, and that lineup obviously went on to win 4 majors in a row, won all 3 of the majors in 2010, broke the prize money record in 2010. And Starix had a long and successful career as a player in Na'vi. He was a player for just over 4 years, because at the very end in December of 2009 is when the team was formed, and then he left, I think it was around April of 2015, with Flamey coming in to replace him. In 1.6, during the Na'vi era, Starix was really the third star of the team. Like, the obvious primary star was Markelov. Then you had Edward, was incredibly impactful as well. Starix was a hybrid AWPer, and he was kind of chilling as the third star, kind of the Cajun B of their team. And sometimes he'd have a big game and take over, but in general, he was more playing sort of off roles and was just a solid player who at times could have big fragging performances. He also, by the way, briefly was the in-game leader in 1.6, where when the team were having issues going into 2012, he actually took over. And I think the only event he was the in-game leader for was IM6 Kiev, which Na'vi actually ended up winning. And in fact, because Zeus was freed up from being the in-game leader, Zeus had some crazy performances in that tournament. But then afterwards, actually, he went back to going being a player, and Zeus took over as the in-game leader again. I think at the time, Zeus maybe just got married or something, or had a kid or something. I think it was maybe just got married. And the key thing is, Starix was actually a pretty good fragger in 1.6, but coming into CSGO, when the team transitioned over, I mean, Markelov clearly was up and down, had his issues. Edward was never as much of a star player, but he was still a solid fragger. Zeus was okay, but as an in-game leader was still very good. Senia really struggled, and I think actually Starix, it's not that he fully struggled, but his impact was really lessened. Like, he just became a good support player. He's a guy who used his brain. His actual skills in CSGO weren't particularly good, but one thing he'd always had from 1.6 was he was like really, really good at the chess master style of playing 1vx situations. A bit like how Zipnix plays them now, where whenever you put the guy in a 1v1 or a 1v2, he's always going to find the angle, he's always going to put himself in the right position where he's going to have a chance at winning the round, or he's going to make the correct decisions to give himself a chance. And then whether he wins it or not is whether you hit the shot or not. But obviously the difference is Zipnix is much more skilled, so he can also do a lot from that. Whereas Starix simply had to just rely on trying to outposition people, which in the early days of CSGO wasn't actually as possible. Just with, I mean, you can't go into too much detail on that. It'd be a whole video on its own. It's worth pointing out that with Zeus gone from the lineup, kicked for simple obviously, the only founding member who remains in the team in the starting lineup or in the organization is Edward. Because Edward actually, obviously, is still a starting member of the team. But even so, actually, Edward doesn't have an unbroken run in Na'vi, because in 2013, Edward left along with Markelov to form Astana Dragons, this super team from CIS region, where they merged the star players of Na'vi with some of the players from the Virtus Pro lineup that had beaten NIP a few times. Now, it didn't work out for Edward in that team, and shortly afterwards, he actually came back to Na'vi's, welcoming open arms, and then they had to make a whole new era of Na'vi. So the big question in this move that not a lot of people seem to be asking, even though it's the most obvious one, is, was Starix a good coach? Now, I noticed because people know Starix is smart and they know he had success as a coach, and because maybe they like him and respect him as a legend of the game, people's answer to that is automatically yes. He must be a good coach. And therefore, it's these stupid players that are at fault, and it's the organization of Na'vi's betrayed him and not giving him better players. Whatever their excuse might be. Here's the answer that I come up with. Yes and no, depending on the circumstances. Now, yes, in what circumstances is Starix a good coach? Well, when the team had Zeus, and before the Valve coaching rule, he was a fantastic coach, as far as we can tell. I mean, he really corralled those players. Some of them, Flamey, Guardian, absolutely players not used to playing within a very tactical system, and yet he implemented them very well and took Zeus's style of calling, that slow style, and if anything, took it to its logical conclusion, implemented it even further, got even more out of Guardian, who at the time had really hit his peak, and most importantly, integrated Flamey into the lineup. Before that, Flamey was this almost like the Bialy of the team. He was like very up and down, and the big ups weren't there that often, and if he turned up, he could win the game for you, but he didn't very consistently, and so he wasn't a very good second star, and that's what he needed to be in that lineup. So, when starix took over as the in-game leader, he'd been the coach for a while anyway. First of all, as the coach, he integrated Flamey into the team. And then when he took over as the in-game leader and the coach, now Flamey started to have superstar performances, once every 3 or 4 tournaments. Now he really started to deliver, and Na'Vi, that's why they were making finals and they could potentially win. He's one of the reasons as to why they got to the final of MLG Columbus. He's one of the reasons why they started to get good around DreamHack Cluj-Napoca and become a world-class team, was Flamey's impact. So you also have to look at Na'Vi's results during that period. And yeah, they're amazing. Na'Vi has all these second places, including at 2 majors. They actually do win a smaller event. They won Counterpit, which had Virtus Pro, which had Astralis, admittedly no Fnatic, no Luminosity. Their T-sides were amazing when he was the coach and the in-game leader. I mean, on maps like Cobble and Train, they could just straight up lose CT half, and you could still pretty much bank on them consistently to win the map by getting monster T halves, 9, 10, 11 rounds routinely. That's how good their T-sides were. So when you consider CT sides in general are a lot more on the players themselves and how they frag, this shows the coordination he brought to that team. Now, in another sense, no, starix is not a good coach, in as much as he wasn't the right coach for this particular squad, this squad with Simple in it. I mean, again, as shown by their results, sure, they won ESL New York, but how did they win ESL New York? Simple had some of the best stats for a tournament you will ever see in Counter-Strike and dominated the tournament. And even then, they narrowly won the 3rd map of the final. Also, teams didn't know their map pool. People hadn't clued in on what the new Na'Vi was like compared to the old Na'Vi. Sure, then they had the top 4 at Epicenter. Beyond that, not a lot though. Now they've gradually grinded their way back. Take a 5th to 8th places, which aren't that good for this level of roster. So you have to remember, he also wasn't as fantastic in the coaching role before he took over as the in-game leader of Na'Vi. He took over as the in-game leader of Na'Vi in September of 2015. Before that, for a sort of like 6 months, he was the coach, and he was certainly helping out with Flamey, and maybe he was helping out somewhere. But beyond Flamey and the fact that it was a different player from starix to Flamey, it didn't look like he did much in terms of coaching. Zeus very much still looked in control, and it was still a Zeus-style team if you looked at the results and how they played. Part of the issue is, without the ability to in-game lead, it does seem as though those amazing approaches weren't implemented. And so there's another question to be had here, which is, what would he have been like if he could have in-game led, as they planned to in this team, but without Zeus? Because the problem is, without ever really seeing that, we don't really have the control group. Like, we don't know, even when he's the coach and in-game leader, what role Zeus maybe had as a secondary caller or something. We're not quite sure in that sense. Or implementing what he knows starix wants to do, and therefore taking 1 out of the 5 players out of starix's mind in terms of having to worry about that guy. We can't be sure in that sense. So we never really got to see fully what starix could do with full control, because Valve kind of cut him away at the legs in that particular sense. Part of the issue that I think makes starix not a good coach for this group of players is the lack of supportive players in this team. So when you have star players and skilled players, and especially a lot of these players just play off their own intuition and their own skill and don't necessarily play within a system traditionally, now you're in a scenario where I feel like a big thing that hits starix hard is he is not a charismatic person. He's not the kind of coach who can win you over with the passion he inspires in you, or say something in a way that's incredibly authoritative and makes you have to listen, and his sheer charisma commands of you that you try and do what he wants and you want to please him. He's not really that kind of a person. If you talk to him, he's a very intelligent, very logical person who's very experienced and did his homework. But as a result, his approach to trying to win players over is with logic. He wants to explain to them how this logically makes sense and how they have to do this so that this follow-on effect can happen and he can build it into his system. Now, the problem with that is if you have charisma and you try to explain all that stuff, even if the player doesn't necessarily understand what you mean, they might just unquestioningly do their part in it. But the problem is, as soon as you're someone who doesn't have charisma, as soon as you start losing, now when the player doesn't understand what you're trying to get across, because he's not as cerebral as you, doesn't see the bigger picture, maybe doesn't understand how his role fits in with it because he's losing and he's doing badly, now is when players will start to ignore you. And now is when they won't necessarily implement what you're saying, or they'll do it half and half. And being in the middle ground when you're trying to do very specific tactics like starix can be the worst of all. That can be an absolute nightmare, and you will get punished heavily by opposing teams for that. So I actually think part of his problem is he tried to be that kind of, I've defined them, I made a video in the past about the types of a leader. I defined that type of leader as a Ulysses type coach, where the idea is people are going to trust him because he's smarter than the rest of us. So if he says something, it must be right. The problem is results have to come for that sort of leader to be able to get his troops to follow him, because what makes the guy smarter than us when we don't understand him? Well, it worked, didn't it? So I don't know how it worked, and I don't know what he was doing, but I'll follow what he's doing. When it doesn't work anymore, when it no longer is the case, now people are going to be like, so why are we following this guy? It didn't work, what he said. I also think, unfortunately, starix hasn't proved to be a good coach without the ability in-game lead, as I alluded to before. I think for his style of play, which is this very methodical style, he needed to be able to speak all the time. He needed to be able to micro certain people, possibly Flamey. He needed full control. And especially with no Zeus in the lineup, to be able to implement some of that and be the general. I particularly think Flamey's the most noticeable one, because Flamey only gets big games now off kills. He looks lost in that lineup, like he's lost his identity as a player, and he doesn't know what he's supposed to be doing within that team. So I actually feel like this ties into a concept I have about how ideas work, which is that if you came up with the idea and you implemented the idea, someone can copy it from you. Like Zeus was trying to copy the starix style. He was listening to starix, and starix was explaining the style to Zeus, and then Zeus was implementing it. But the problem is the person who came up with the idea, because of how their mind comes up with it, we don't tend to put ideas, big ideas necessarily together by piece. That's how we break them down and understand them and analyze them. But because we tend to just suddenly have this confluence of a bunch of thoughts fixed into an idea, and then we can examine it all around, the person who comes up with the idea tends to be able to examine it from all angles and then understand what his reference points originally were, whereas the guy who's disassembling it might have a harder time figuring out how pieces fit together, or what the logic behind why you even came up with that, or what you're trying to solve with it. And so I feel like C's never had a full grasp on what starix was trying to do, and also, it seems like starix didn't get the idea across to him or the team was simply incapable of playing that style. And this is another key point to make. So I think starix is a good coach in terms of all coaches, and in terms of if he had any team to command. But is he a good coach in terms of this Na'vi lineup? Doesn't seem like it to me, and that's been something I've been very skeptical about as soon as Simple actually joined the team. Because I don't think this is the right combination of players to play that slow style. I think there's too many star players to play that approach. So I actually feel like, whereas before they had a good mix of players, not the best, like I still don't think for that style of play they actually had the best mix, because they had all these aggressive Russian players, Ukrainian players who play off aim, etc., but they were able to corral them enough to make it work. I almost thought sometimes in spite of the players the system worked. It was similar to how I think Fallen took all those Brazilian players, who I didn't think a lot of them were that cerebral to begin with, and really imprinted in them how to play the game. And his, if anything, was a slightly even more successful experiment in that sense, because they got a lot more autonomy than in the starix system, where he had to still very much have everyone on a leash to some degree. So I feel like with this sort of kind of players, you need more of an up-tempo approach. You need to play a looser style. You need to play a more fragging style. You need to play faster on the clock, so there's less decision-making time for the opponents, and you're just hitting them hard and sending guys like Flamey in and using his crosshair to win you battles, not using the ground he can make up and then someone watching his flank and then taking over this area and then executing into the next quadrant. That approach doesn't really work, I think, for this many talented star players, unless you're going to trim down and add more supportive elements who can buttress that up and really kind of harness what the coach is trying to do, because remember, he can't talk very often thanks to the Valve coaching rule. So that's another thing to say, is that really Valve are the ones that fucked with starix's career. If he could still in-game lead, I'm pretty sure he could have done a lot in this team. I don't know if they'd ever be as good. I know Simple could obviously be a fantastic player, but I don't know if they could be the number one team, but I certainly think they could be much better, and they could win best of 3 series in a way that they don't right now. Now, interestingly enough, starix has said in his own statement, apparently he might play again. He's going to start playing again. He's going to stream. Possibly he will be a coach again, depending on what the offers are. He wants to see what's happening. He and himself even kind of acknowledged like maybe he just wasn't the right coach for this group of people. I mean, it sounds like he tried everything. If you talk to him, he had his approach and he obviously couldn't get that across, or it simply did not work. I certainly think there's room for him in this industry. It's an issue that he's probably going to want to keep living in Ukraine and maybe won't want to play for anyone outside of CIS. That gives you limited options. If he was willing to go beyond that though, if he was willing to move to another country, etc., there should be many, many options because this guy, he can speak English. He certainly can get his ideas across. He's a very logical guy and he can break down a lot about the game and how you study it. So I think he was a good coach. It's just that he didn't fit this particular makeup of Na'Vi.